Do 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 do. Extras.
Whole bunch of little things from this episode. I can't get into some of the bigger ones, like what they wanted with the ley line, since it's part of a 3 episode block where many events were happening simultaneously in-game and in a real disorganized sequence of events at the table. The episodes aren't exactly chronological from either point of view, but rather I divided them up in such a way as to make as much narrative sense as possible. After all, who cares if, in actually playing it out, we were bouncing back and forth between Polaron and Bankton or Corso's Chasm to keep all the players involved. The so-called Fire Guys and Earth Guys the party had encountered before, as minions, presented an interesting sort of challenge for Angel. As minions, they have few hit points and are expected to die in one hit most of the time. However, being pretty high-level minions, these ones had to have enough HP to have a decent chance to survive a single magic missile. That's literally my standard. Though it happens to help against a lot of things which do small amounts of automatic damage. But because of their types, they also had a little damage reduction and some energy resistances and were immune to critical hits, which includes sneak attack. Now, Little One or Black would basically auto-kill them with any melee hit, but since Angel's weapon had a lower damage die, being sized for a small creature, and rather than brute strength, her damage comes from fiery weapon property, her elemental damage weapon crystals, and whenever possible sneak attack, she's all spread out over different damage types, and their separate protections against each of those things work together to make her chance of killing him in one shot kind of low. Her force crossbow would have a better chance, but with her reach and proper positioning, she gets so many free attacks it's hard to beat the spike chain anyway, but it sure kept it interesting. What would have been less interesting would have been if I had changed the damage type on the artillery golem's primary missile attacks, like I wanted to. I already knew I wanted them to have a physical damage component instead of being 100% fire, but I left them the same way they had been against the players, and so, much like against the fire-resistant players, the area fire attacks were but useless against the immunity of the minions. Though, even just handing out constant charges for the Reconstructor Rod was enough to make it very hard for the antagonists to win. But if I had changed their rocket damage to be half physical, they would have been pretty brutal at wiping out minions in a large area. Now, I'm sure at least a couple of you wondered, if the Earth guys have tremor sense, why don't they attack the invisible shield generator? They were stuck in a bit of an AI catch-22. When following normal attack orders, they tend to ignore targets with no apparent attacks or spellcasting until actual threats have been dealt with. So, they don't see the shield generator as worth attacking until they've killed everything else, which is pretty hard, what with those crazy temp HP shields. But the Dragonborn, who would definitely be smart enough to tell them, yes, prioritize that invisible thing, they can't see it because it's invisible. And the elemental minions don't really communicate unless ordered to, so they don't tell anyone, hey, there's an invisible thing here. The guys who can see it don't know they should prioritize it, and the guys who would know that don't know that it's there, so the shield generator was able to flawlessly fulfill its purpose, making the golems within 60 feet almost indestructible against these minions. One of the things which often slows down my episode creation, for better or for worse, is that I tend to have one or two key visuals or scenes in mind for each episode, a couple of distinctive things that I think would add a lot if I could show them, even if most of the episode is talking heads without lip movement. Sometimes these are little things, just little touches which are fun or cool or otherwise stick in my head, yet which don't take a lot of work. In this episode, that's the start of the Slicing Golem's attack run, when the sphere rolls down the hall, rushing past a bunch of minions to get as many as possible into its radius. Now, because it doesn't have an official trample attack, a large creature shouldn't be allowed to move through the squares of medium-sized enemies without tumbling. But I don't care. I treated it kind of like a free overrun, meaning the enemies can just choose to squeeze out of the way. But that doesn't change the issue that when it stops in the crowded hall, it would be stopping directly on top of not one, not two, but 4 freaking enemies, which have nowhere to go. My answer? Since it was rolling down to activate its standard action slicing attack anyway, I described it as starting rotated 90 degrees such that when it first opened the blades, it popped itself upwards, butchering those guys directly underneath. I still rolled saves for them, but I just chose that the first 4 to die happened to be those ones. Map grid problem solved. I loved the mental image of that, so I made sure to show it, and I went out of my way to get a license-free sound effect for the sound of the sphere kicking itself up and landing with a dull metallic thud. That sound effect made it awesome for me and at least one commenter, so mission accomplished. Now, that didn't take much. What hurt time-wise for this episode was the post-credit scene. I had a vision for this scene, a vision for this shot, and it was way more of a cinematic shot than you normally see in TDDC. Plus, it meant I had to draw the Diluvian sniper from multiple angles, which I hardly ever do, and get it done for episode 42, even though I easily could have put him off to the next episode. That said, there was a whole bunch of other new stuff I knew I'd need to draw for the next episode. No spoilers here. So, at least this wasn't a totally extra image. It was saving me from having to draw it later. But to do a long zoom-out shot, I still had to create a high-resolution version of my low-res Corso's Chasm image. Because of file size and resolution limitations, I also needed a close-up of the building and the window, and I needed the foreground elements, the rock and the sniper, and to put it all together and sync it to the music for maximum effect. On the one hand, I think the effect was awesome. It was reasonably good translation of the ideal version in my imagination. Seems really impressive compared to my usual crap animation. On the other hand, it took a whole bunch of work for something that is arguably after the episode is over. Plus, like the couple of bad guy vision scenes with Swain, it is a scene that neither the characters nor even the players actually knew about. But beyond the actual coolness of it, I justify it somewhat by the fact that I was able to use the image of the city to improve multiple otherwise static talking description scenes, and both that and the sniper are things I would have wanted in the next episode. Even then, I had to cut details to save time, mainly on the city. You can see a lot of empty space on the left side. That was supposed to be filled up with colorful tents and awnings, with enough detail, in other words, to at least suggest the thriving marketplace. Of all the things to spend forever on, though, the city picture was not one, and it had already taken more time than I wanted to get those basic-ass buildings lined up in a way that would work well enough for the zoom. Fun fact, the music piece used here, which I named TDDC Breakdown in the credits, is a piece I actually made up of scraps left over from the epic boss theme and from another piece I made for the next episode. I don't have any good ways that I know how to use to actually scratch build a piece of music from the notes up. The MIDI instruments I found all suck. Acid Music Studio really doesn't seem great for that task, so even though I've composed some music in my head that I really want to make someday, I can't make those things well enough to use them. So instead, my music-making process is to gather all kinds of license-free loops, mostly from looperman.com, which I then slice and dice, tone shift, etc., and keep trying them in different combinations until I get something resembling the feel I was going for, and then keep tweaking and refining until I like the overall result, or it's good enough. I really like about half of my TDDC music, the rest of it is just adequate. Well, in this process, I find all kinds of ways that I can combine 2 or 3 loops or sounds that happen to turn into something surprisingly cool. There were some really cool combinations of bells and beats that I stumbled onto in making the Raj theme, for example. But sometimes I find something that sounds really cool and just doesn't fit. I had so many of these after the boss theme and this other one that I took a couple hours and slapped them together into one run-on piece, which has no real rhyme or reason. But all the parts of it sounded cool. It's a little hard to use in a video, because the different sections overlap too much, and there aren't many good start-end points. But the climax at the end of the piece worked really well for this grand zoom-out in stages shot, and I love the result. So what were those 2 dudes, anyway? Those of you familiar with a lot of weird 3.5 edition books probably figured out that the green from Dragon Magic, I believe. DFA is like a dragon-themed version of the 3.5 edition Warlock. Instead of firing ranged touch Eldritch Blasts, they have reflex for half breath weapon attacks. This makes them uncomfortably close ranged, but it's pretty cool to have at-will area damage. This one, his name was Fadir, didn't make much use of that, but in addition to some pretty powerful invocations, like at-will Chilling Fog if you're high enough level, they also have those crazy crowd control mods for their breath weapon, allowing them, instead of dealing damage, to inflict strength penalties or the slow effect with no saving throw. I mean, there is a saving throw for half duration, and the durations are very short anyway. But save for half means even if you pass, you still suffer the penalties for at least one round. I don't have enough experience to tell if it's really balanced, but at least it's novel. His blue ally, whose name is Imasa, was a little less obvious. Clearly he had a couple levels of Sword Sage, allowing him to use a few maneuvers, including a throw to take advantage of his significant strength. But he was actually mostly Dragon Shaman, giving him some cool buff auras and the ability to heal a pile of damage and or remove negative conditions with his Lay on Hands ability. As for what spell he was casting when he failed his concentration check, you're going to love this. I literally have no idea. As far as I can tell, he doesn't have any spells. And I'm pretty sure if he was just going to heal and remove blindness from himself, Lay on Hands doesn't require concentration. So, yeah, that clearly happened in the session. It seemed important, had dialogue. I have no clue what I thought he was casting, or why he thought it was going to improve the terrible, terrible situation he and Fadir were in. As for how they summon those elemental minions, sometimes you just have to say, they have a ritual to do this, because it makes them better antagonists. I wanted the elemental minions, they control them, so they come from somewhere, even if it is something not intended to be available for players. If players had the ability to summon such large numbers of junk minions for apparently long durations, that would be way too easily abused. Odds and ends, Angel has a sword? Yep, she actually has a small-sized longsword. She's apparently been hauling around. They've looted several of them over time, and if it's not masterwork, the sell value is pretty meaningless, so she just kept one as a backup weapon. And for style. As for the discussion of how they could be certain that GE7 wasn't possessed, that was totally the discussion they had. They'd thought about it earlier, questioned him, but by this point they were ready to return to Polaron, and they basically decided that if a Dark Ancient had the memories, which they were pretty sure was why Delta was so interested in TR4, then there was nearly no way to tell if their friend had been taken over. So they gave up trying, instead just planning to watch him very carefully when he meets the controller and deal with the disaster if it happens. I'm putting this up early for you, my Patreon patrons, so you can let me know what big issues or questions have I forgotten that aren't a part of episode 43 or 44. I know it's hard to hold off on some of those. I mean, if those are your questions, ask them anyway, but I'll obviously hold them for the appropriate extras video to theoretically avoid spoilers. But if I can give a decent non-spoiler answer to your questions, I'll try to fit them into the final version of this that goes out on YouTube. Thanks so much for your continued support, and with a special shout-out to Sarosh, Surf USA, Gorfiend, Warsaw, Pericles, Lord Aben, Duskmar, and Tyranno McG. It's probably Tyranno McG. I've been calling him Tyranno MCG for like 1,000 years. And somewhere, recently I realized that's probably McG. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. Whatever. The members of the organization. Plus, several other generous individuals who are donating at that level, but don't seem to want the recognition, or their payments haven't processed yet. So, if you change your minds, just send me an email with cloaked figure in the subject line, and we can figure out an avatar for you like these guys.